Good morning and happy 4th of July. I want to welcome you to our online worship gathering here at Hub City Church this 4th of July. If we haven't met, my name's Jonathan. I'm really excited that you have chosen to worship with us and really to celebrate our country's independence together as we worship God. You know, I was thinking about our country's independence, and as Americans, man, we have a lot to celebrate, right? I mean, we have so many great freedoms. Think about them: the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the right to assembly, the right to bear arms, or as the t-shirt says, the right to arm bears, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, I'm so grateful for all of our freedoms, but I think we could all agree, or at least I think we should agree, that as followers of Jesus, our citizenship is in the kingdom of God first, and second, in our country, the United States of America. And I know sometimes we get those confused, but one of the things I want to reemphasize today is that we as followers of Jesus, we should live differently. Like we can enjoy our rights and privileges as Americans. We should enjoy our rights and privileges as Americans, but we are called to live according to a different standard. And so today, I want to talk a little bit about that different standard and how we as followers of Jesus should live as free people, because our freedoms are a tad bit different than the freedoms that come as Americans. And we're going to use something that Paul writes in Galatians chapter 5. And I was just going to look at one verse out of Galatians 5, but the beginning of the chapter is so good. I want to look at a few of the verses at the beginning, and then we'll just skip down to verse 13 and camp out there for a little bit. I hope that this whets your appetite, not just to reread these verses, but to read the whole chapter and maybe even the whole book sometime over the next few days. But we're going to start off with what Paul says in Galatians 5, chapter 1. Look at what he says. He says, "So Christ has truly set us free." That's good news, right? I think we'd all agree that that's good news. That's what we celebrate today. But as we're about to see, the freedom that Paul is talking about is a different kind of freedom. He goes on and says this. He says, "Now make sure that you stay free and don't get tied up again in slavery to the law." See, what Paul is talking about is a different kind of freedom. This isn't the freedom that we learn about when we're learning about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in middle school. Paul isn't talking about the freedom to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. He's not talking about the freedom of speech or the freedom of religion or any of that. It's what Paul is talking about is we are set free from the law. See, what he's really getting at is we are free from having to earn our way to God. See, there were some Jewish Christians who had snuck into the church in Galatia, and they were trying to convince the Galatians that they not only had to follow Jesus, but they also had to follow the law. Specifically, as we're about to see, they had to be circumcised and then follow all the rest of the laws, which is just a horrible thing to think about. But Paul reminds them that they are free from the law. They're free from its requirements. They're free from trying to have to earn their way to God. Look at what he says next. He says, "Listen." Like, that's an emphasis there to make sure you pay attention to what he's about to say. "I, Paul, tell you this. If you are counting on circumcision to make you right with God, then Christ will be of no benefit to you." I mean, just imagine for a minute if we had to have a little circumcision booth set up outside the church, and anybody who wanted to become a Christian had to go there first, and then they become a Christian. That's kind of what these people were arguing. Aren't you glad we don't have to do that? He goes on and says this. "I'll say it again. If you're trying to find favor with God by being circumcised, you must obey every regulation in the whole law of Moses." Every regulation. That's 613 different laws. You got to obey them all if you're going to find favor with God from that. It goes on. It says, "For if you are trying to make yourselves right with God by keeping the law, you have been cut off from Christ. You have fallen away from God's grace." What Paul says here is that this freedom that we have, that he's clear that we have, is a gift of grace, and we can't have it both ways. We can't be made right with God through the law and be made right with God through grace. If you're trusting in the law to save you, if you're trusting in your ability to be good enough or to follow enough rules to save you, then you've abandoned God's grace. And that's, Paul says, don't do that. Don't get sidetracked from there. And the next few verses kind of unpack that a little bit more, and you can read those on your own. But I want us to skip down to verse 13, because this is so, so good. Look at what Paul says here. For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. Now notice who he's talking to. He's not talking to people who aren't followers of Jesus. He's talking to brothers and sisters. That is, people who are in the family of God, people who call themselves Christians. And he says that we have been called to live in freedom. And he makes this point over and over again, that we as Christians should live lives of liberty, lives of freedom. Jesus came to set the captives free, not to keep people in bondage or put them in bondage all over again. I think that freedom is actually is the fundamental basis for all Christian living and for how we should make decisions. And Paul is getting at that here. And I just have to make a time out here, because when I read this, I think it's worth asking ourselves at this question. Do other people see us as people of freedom and liberty? Like when outsiders, when non-Christians look at our lives, do they see us as people of freedom and liberty? See, I think that they see the opposite, right? What they see when they look at us is people who are bound up in legalism or bound up in rules and hung up on things more than anybody else. But Paul says, man, you guys are called to be free. You can lay aside the law. And then he goes on and says this. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Even though you're called to be free, and you are free, don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. I think Paul is pretty clear here that we can choose to use our freedom to satisfy our sinful nature. That option is open to us. We can take this amazing freedom that God has given us and spin it and use it a way to please ourselves at the expense of others. We can use our freedom in such a way as that we trample all over others. I think if we're honest, that's kind of what we see all over our country right now, and maybe even all over the world. We use our freedom to get what we want. Like, we use our freedom to think about our three most favorite people, me, myself, and I. That's really what our freedom is used for a lot of times. But Paul says, don't do that. Don't do that. That even though you are free, don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Don't use your freedom to satisfy that part of yourself that's all about you, that says, I don't really care about God or what he says. I don't really care about others. No, don't use your freedom to do that. And I think it's easy. Or I think for some people, I've talked to people like this, maybe you know some people like this, I hope you're not one of these people, that they think that their freedom that they have in Christ is a freedom to sin, or maybe it's a freedom to do whatever it is that my heart tells me I want to do. But Paul says, don't use your freedom to indulge your sinful nature. Instead, see, the freedom we have in Jesus is this Spirit-given desire and ability to do what we should do before God, which is exactly what Paul says next. Look at what he says. Instead of using your freedom to indulge your sinful nature, even though you're free, instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. Well, you want to know how to use your freedom? You need to use your freedom not on yourself, not for me, myself, and I. You should use your freedom to serve one another in love. I think this right here is what separates us, or what should separate us as followers of Jesus from everybody else in our country that's celebrating their independence today. That we should not use our freedom for ourselves or for our agenda or to satisfy our sinful nature or our wants and our wishes. No, we should use our freedom to serve one another in love. And something happens when we do that, by the way. When we use our freedom to serve others and not on ourselves, we actually fight against our sinful nature. And I would go so far as to say that this is how we can conquer our sinful nature, is if we are focusing on others instead of ourselves. See, we don't overcome our sinful nature by separating ourselves from other people. No, we overcome it by putting others before ourselves, by getting out, by serving others. And if you think about it, that is the exact pattern that Jesus set for us. I mean, I think it could be argued that Jesus was the most free person that ever lived. Yet Jesus used his freedom not for his own self, but to serve others in love. That's why Paul says this in verse 14 next. He says, for the whole law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. He takes the Galatians back to the great commandment. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. This attitude and action of serving one another in love is how we live out this second commandment. But then he gives a warning at the end of this passage. He says, but if you're always biting and devouring one another, watch out. Beware of destroying one another. Maybe it's just me, but don't you feel like this is a perfect description of the culture that we live in right now? We seem to be always biting and devouring one another. Paul is describing or painting a picture of a pack of wild animals who are going at each other, trying to fight for who's the alpha dog, trying to see who's in charge. And he's saying that this is exactly how the church can act when it uses its freedom to serve itself. When it uses its freedom as a platform to promote selfishness. This is how the church is going to end up if we keep thinking only of ourselves. We'll end up destroying one another. I think that's a pretty harsh warning that we need to pay attention to, especially in the culture where God has placed us today. That's why we've got to go back to what Paul says, to not use our freedom to serve our sinful nature, but instead to use our freedom to serve one another in love. So what's my point? This is my point for today. As we celebrate our freedom as Americans, let's remember that as Christians, we are called to a new way of living, in a different way of living. We're called to leverage our freedom, not for ourselves, not for our rights, not for what we want, but we are called to leverage our freedom to serve one another in love. To leverage this freedom that we have for the benefit of others. See, you are called to be free, but use your freedom to serve. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to think through some questions. I've got some questions. You can discuss these with your family. You can discuss these with just God. You can spend some time with him or maybe some friends, but just think through some of these things. First is this. How can you serve someone this week? How can you serve someone this week? If you're going to put what Paul says into practice, how can you serve someone this week? Second question is, do you find yourself using your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature? I think all of us would say yes, if we're honest, right? How do you do that? I don't think we can change what we're doing unless we bring what we're doing to light. And that's what that question is getting at. Do you find yourself using your freedom to serve your sinful nature? How are you doing that? And then look around you. How do you see Christians, not non-Christians? We're not talking about non-Christians. We're talking about those who are on the inside, those who believe what we believe, who call themselves followers of Jesus. How do you see Christians leveraging their freedoms for selfish gains? I don't think you have to look very hard to find an answer to that question, right? And then how do you do that? How are you doing that on a regular basis? I think all of us do in one way or another. And then the last thing I want to encourage you to do is to memorize Galatians 5:13. If there were ever a verse that we should celebrate, that we should read on the day when our country celebrates its independence, it's this verse right here. For you have been called to live in freedom. It's good news, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. That is a verse that I think all of us need to not only commit to memory, but need to repeat over and over and over again. And I can't think of a better time for us to repeat this command to ourselves than this day when we celebrate our nation's independence, when we celebrate our freedoms. And I hope you have a great day celebrating with family or friends. I don't know if we're allowed to shoot fireworks right now, but if you're able to go see some fireworks, I hope you have some fun doing that. But remember, whatever you do, who is someone that you can serve this week? How can you serve someone else in love this week? Not leveraging your freedom for your own selfish gain or your own agenda, but leveraging your freedom for the sake of others. And as we kind of wrap up, just want to remind you that I think today, since we're not gathering in person, today's a great day for you to try out online giving. If you don't give, if you usually bring your gift here, you can do that at our website, hubcitychurch.com/give. But thanks for joining us today. I hope you guys have a great celebration. I look forward to seeing you in person next week as we start a brand new series. And have a great July 4th.